Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Here in the Gospel of Luke are two men caught up in a single moment of time during which they each examined and evaluated their life and then came to very different conclusions. The Pharisee saw himself as a paragon of virtue, and indeed he may have been so. By all accounts, he really was a good man, a proper upstanding citizen, and a man of singular virtue, worthy of praise. When he looked at his life, he gave thanks to God that he was such a man, and not like some other people whose lives always seem to be a total shipwreck. Then there is this tax collector. Being a tax collector back then was not like working for the IRS. This was a dirty business. It involved cheating people by collecting more taxes than were actually due. That was just good business, and you could get rich doing this. Never mind the effect it had on others, nor the questionable ethics of helping to support a bunch of ruthless and cruel people. A man's got to make a living, right? I think that his moment of clarity was very different. I think that he suddenly saw himself and realized just how his life was impacting the life of so many others. His opulent lifestyle came at a cost. It had cost him his soul. We don't really need to speculate on what other sins he may or may not have also committed. Thou shalt not steal is enough. What he did was legal, of course. At least the Roman legion thought so. But that didn't make it moral. Thank God we're not like him, right? Except maybe we are like him in all the wrong ways and none of the right ways that we really should be. All of us live now in close community with others. But while we may be prospering, others around us are suffering. We may not believe that we are directly responsible for that suffering, but if we don't care about these people, then somehow in the grand scheme of things, I think we are at least part of the reason why they are suffering. That is the thing about sin. Sin is always communal, because our sin, no matter which of them you might choose, will always affect other people. And because God cares about people, what we do or even what we don't do matters to God. To paraphrase Paul just a little, although we may be a paragon of virtue, yet without love, we are still sinners in the eyes of God. That puts all of us in the same category as this tax collector. But without the one thing that really made him different from the Pharisee, because for at least one brief moment, this tax collector saw clearly how the pursuit of his life without compassion had hurt others. That moment of clarity enabled God's grace to reach to him and to begin the process of divine response that hopefully changed his life forever. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God, Jesus said. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Which is to say that those who make the welfare of others more important than their own welfare will be honored by God. The definition of humility is the quality of having a modest view of one's value or importance in relation to others. The opposite of such humility is pride. There is the proverb which says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, and with humility comes wisdom. And just to throw in something from the New Testament, the book of James says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This sort of pride is not to be confused with the pride movement. This sort of pride is basically self-deception. It blinds us to our limitations, which are many, and it isolates us from God and from other people. No one was prouder, nor ever had more reason to be so, than Saul of Tarsus. He was a Pharisee's Pharisee. And ironically, it was only when he was struck blind that Paul could finally see himself clearly. Later on, he himself would say, if anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. He should know. He also said, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. So, what if righteousness, our righteousness, is actually defined by whether or not we value others over ourselves? If so, we might well ask ourselves, am I really a good person? What if the goal is, as the prophet Micah said, just to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? As a song by Mac Davis said, oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. If we decide that we are perfect, as the Pharisee did, then we have no need for God's grace at all. Except, if that is the case, then we really, really do. Righteousness is not a checklist of thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that. It is really an attitude which connects us with God and helps us to love one another as we should. We don't have to wallow in self-loathing in order to receive God's grace, but I do think that we need to see ourselves the way that God sees us. The very same God that cares about us also cares about the welfare of others. So we should too. I think that this God and this parable calls upon all of us to surrender our egos in the service of love and justice. C.S. Lewis once called pride the great sin and the root of all others, because it sets self above God and neighbor. That was the sin of the Pharisee in this parable. He set himself above that tax collector over there, never seeing just how much he was really like him in his inability to love others as he should. He never realized his sin or how much he needed the grace of God. The sin of the tax collector was also the same one, that of not loving others as he should. Up until that moment, the welfare of no one but himself mattered to him at all. Jesus' parable was almost satirical in sharing this message in the way that he did, because Jesus said that if we ever wanted to be made right with God, then we should become more like the tax collector. Who would ever have imagined that could be true? But all of us are in the same situation. In our need for God's grace, we are no different than anyone else, and so blind to that truth sometimes. We are riddled not only with imperfections, but with vain ambitions, that we can actually somehow make ourselves what we should be without God's help. However, God sees us as we are, and we see ourselves only in a mirror dimly, and we think we look okay. The best we can ever hope for is a moment of clarity, like this tax collector had, just enough to put us once again at the feet of Jesus. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Paul said, and all are justified freely by his grace, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. John Newton famously was a captain of a slave ship, and later on an investor in the slave trade. He himself could date the moment when he became a Christian as March 21st, 1748, and from that moment on, he avoided the profanity, gambling, and drinking that had been in his life before that. You might say he cleaned up his life pretty well, but he was still involved in the slave trade. And he was even a tax collector for a while in 1755, and then he became a preacher. You can decide for yourself which was worse. It was quite a while before he eventually became an abolitionist too. As John Newton famously said at one point, I am not what I ought to be. I am not what I want to be. I am not what I hope to be in another world, but still I am not what I once used to be, and by the grace of God, I am what I am. Therein, we can see just a little humility. He did not write the hymn for which he is best known until much later still, in 1779, Amazing Grace. The amazing thing about God's grace is that it is always there, available to anyone who finally sees themselves clearly and humbly bows before God and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You see, the truth is, you can be a pretty good person and still be a sinner and still be in desperate need of God's grace. Because none of us can really see how we have unknowingly contributed to the suffering in this world through our actions or our indifference. It is God alone who knows us. God alone knows what our life should be and how it could be, if only we learned how to love one another as we should. If only we valued their well-being above our own. The process of our redemption begins with our humble prayer, and it ends in glory, not ours, but Christ's. I take, O cross, your shadow for my abiding place. I ask no other sunshine than the sunshine of his face, content to let the world go by, to know no gain or loss, my sinful self my only shame, my glory all the cross. Be safe, and God bless you.